Everybody, this is Mr. Peoples here, and today we're going to be talking about the causes of the Civil War. On the screen you can see the learning target that we have for this section, that you should be able to identify the causes of the Civil War, and there's three of them that we're going to be talking about: slavery, states' rights, and secession. And so keep your eyes open for those three things as we talk about the causes of the Civil War. Now, as we move forward here, we're going to be taking some notes. Now, the notes that you need to take, anything in blue, you're going to write down in your notes under the appropriate spot. So if you need to pause this or stop it so that you can write everything down, then please do so. I've tried to keep what you need to write down short and only the important things to remember. So just remember that whatever's in blue, you do. All right, let's move forward here. All right, around the time of the Civil War in the 1850s, the North and the South had two very different economies. The North had a lot more people, more population, and many of the businesses in the North were factories and merchants, and so the North had become an industrial type economy. That's why you can see pictured here on the screen, you can see the factory there on the bottom left. Now the South did not have as many people, and so the South, their economy, because they had more open space, their economy was still based on farming and specifically cotton. And so the South had many farms and cotton plantations. Now, in the late 1790s, slavery in the North had been virtually eliminated. In the South, slavery as an institution was starting to die out as well. Cotton wasn't a very easy crop to harvest. It took a lot of time to pull the seeds out of the cotton, and to give you an example, it would take one slave 10 hours just to produce a single pound of lint. Now, in 1794, a man by the name of Eli Whitney invented a hand-powered engine that he called the cotton gin. And this invention would pull the seeds out of the cotton quickly and easily. Now, to have 1,000 pounds of lint, it would only take 1 day to make that 1,000 pounds of lint, whereas before it would take 417 days to make 1,000 pounds of lint. Okay, so very soon after this invention was introduced, cotton was being planted throughout the South, and because of that, right around 1795 or so, slavery started to increase, and the slave trade started to increase. So by the time we get to 1861, which is when the Civil War starts, 4 million people in the South were slaves. Now, in the whole population of the South, there were 9 million people. So there were 5 million non-slaves and 4 million slaves. That was 1 out of every 7 Americans that were owned by another American in 1861. Pretty amazing, and slavery was very much a big part of the reason how the South kept their economy strong. Here's a picture of a cotton gin. This was taken at the Museum of American History, and you would turn the crank and the cotton would go through, and these little wires would kind of pull the seeds out, and they would drop into that bottom receptacle right there in the bottom of the cotton gin. Now this is a small version of it, but they had larger ones as well. Okay, so slavery was very important for the South so that their businesses, their farms, could make money. If they didn't have slaves to farm that land, then they didn't have money for their families or for their stuff there that they needed at their homes. So as we move forward here, once slavery starts to catch on again in the South and cotton is being planted in the South, we also have people moving from the very populated eastern side of America into the new areas that had just been bought. And in 1820, Missouri wanted to become a state. So did the state of Maine. And so you can see Missouri on this map is right here, M-O, and Maine is right here, M-E. Now, one of the problems is that when these two states wanted to become states, there was a balance of power. The North had the same amount of power as the South, and by power I mean in making the laws. The number of representatives and senators was equal for both North and South. if these states came in and they both were, say, slave states, then the southern slave states would have more power. Or if they were both free states, the northern free states would have more power. So there was a compromise that had to be made. The compromise was that Maine would enter as a free state, that's why it's green on the map there, and Missouri would enter as a slave state, that's why it's blue on the map. And what this did is it kept that balance of power between the North and the South. So neither side had more power. Now, one of the other things they did was they said that, from now on, anything above this line, the 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude line, anything from there on, anything north of that is going to be free, and anything south of that can be slave. But then in 1846 and 1848, we have a war with Mexico. And when we have this war, we win. You might remember the story of the Alamo, that's during that war. We gain new territory. We gain places like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and this part over here, part of California. So we gain a lot of these western states after that war. And then something big happens in this new territory in 1849. And you can probably guess, knowing that the San Francisco 49ers are named after this something big. And that's what gold was found in California. And that sent a lot of miners looking for their riches in gold. And so a lot of people moved from the eastern part of the United States to the western part out by California. What this meant is that California was ready to become a state a lot faster than people expected. And so here's the problem, though. The problem is that California straddles that line from the Compromise of 1820. And so was the state going to be a free state? Was it going to be a slave state? It's going to have two senators, and whichever side it falls on, northern or southern side, that side is going to have an advantage. It's going to break the balance of power. Okay? So they come to a compromise, and that is called the Compromise of 1850. And the compromise allows California to enter the Union as a free state. So now those northern states, the free states, have more power in making the laws. And the balance of power is now shifted to the north. The South agreed to this because they wanted the northern states to enforce a more strict Fugitive Slave Act. Okay? The southern states had been losing, the farmers of the South had been losing slaves to the Underground Railroad. People like Harriet Tubman would come across and lead slaves off of their plantations and lead them north. Well, the southern states said, you in the north need to send those slaves back when they come back. And you need to give those back because they're our property, and we don't want to lose our property. So we'll let you have California to enter as a free state, but you need to enforce this more strict Fugitive Slave Act. Let's talk about the Fugitive Slave Act a little bit more. It made it a crime to help runaway slaves. And so those people on the Underground Railroad, after the Compromise of 1850, were breaking the law. And it also allowed officials to arrest runaway slaves in free areas. So if you were someone that, if you were an African American walking through a northern city and someone accused you of being a runaway slave, or you looked like a runaway slave from the South, you could be arrested. And so slaveholders could take suspected fugitives to what were called U.S. commissioners, and these commissioners then decided their fate. And what's crazy about this is the commissioners got more money for returning them as slaves and less money to decide if they were free people. So if you can imagine this, a trial happens, and the judge of that trial gets paid more money to say that that person was a slave. And so oftentimes there were free people, people that had not been slaves, that were actually put into slavery and sent to the South because the judge had ruled that they were former slaves. And make matters worse, the accused fugitives, the people that were being accused of being runaway slaves, they couldn't testify on their own behalf. So they couldn't say anything. They couldn't say, hey, no, I'm a free person. They couldn't do any of that because they weren't allowed to speak. Okay? So this is part of the compromise. Okay? So the northern states have more power, but now they have to start sending fugitive slaves back to the South. Then, in 1852, a woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, she was greatly angered by the Fugitive Slave Act, which is why she wrote this book. And the main character in the book, Tom, is a slave that is sold and separated from his wife, and later on in the book, he's beaten and killed in a rage by his owner. 2 million copies of this book were sold. It's the first American bestseller. And many people are shocked to read about the cruel stories of slavery. People in the North had always saw slavery as kind of, old-fashioned, but they never really understood the violent side of slavery. And this book points out a lot of those the violent pieces of slavery. The Queen of England actually read the book and was known to have cried after reading the book. So, very powerful book. And again, it creates some more separation between Northerners and Southerners. Northerners thinking that the slavery thing is old-fashioned, and Southerners thinking that the North is trying to take away their property. Because that's how they saw slaves, was as their property. So in 1854, just 4 years after the Compromise of 1850, Kansas and Nebraska are set to become states. And so in 1854, Kansas and Nebraska are made territories. There's enough population, enough people there to make them as territories. And they were allowed, the people in those territories were allowed to vote whether they would be a free state or a slave state. And because of this, violence erupted. People came in from all over, from the North and the South, to Kansas, and they tried to fight for what they wanted that state to be. So you had people that were for slavery coming into the state, and you had people that were against slavery, and eventually these two groups got in contact with each other, and violence occurred. And when violence happened, Kansas fell into this civil war where about 200 people were killed. And through the course of the Civil War, Kansas had two governments. It had a free government and a slave government because of that. And that wasn't settled until the Civil War finished. Here you can see the different colors, the green indicating free states, the blue indicating slave states, and then the orange indicating states that were allowed to vote for their whether they were going to be free or slave. And Kansas territory was where the violence erupted. Okay, then as we get closer and closer here to the Civil War, 1857 now is the year that we're at. We have a court case known as the Dred Scott case. And Dred Scott was a slave of a man named Dr. John Emerson, and he lived in Missouri, but Dr. Emerson spent a lot of time traveling to places like Wisconsin, Illinois, and even Minnesota, taking his slave Dred Scott with him. When Emerson died, Scott was promised by Dr. Emerson that he'd have his freedom, but the family of Dr. Emerson wouldn't allow him to go free, so he sued the Emerson family for his freedom because he had spent so much time in free states he believed that he was free. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1857. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was a man named Roger Taney, and he was from a slaveholding family in Maryland, he says that because Scott isn't a citizen, because he's an African American, that he has no rights under the Constitution, and that he didn't have the right to sue. They shouldn't have even been there. And so he decided that African Americans had no right to which a white man was bound to respect. And so the Supreme Court rules that African Americans were not citizens of the United States in 1857. And again, this creates a bigger separation between North and South. Southerners had been saying, oh, African Americans are just property, slaves are just property, they're our property like a chair is our property. While the Northerners started to see them more as human beings, as people, and the institution of slavery as being old-fashioned. So this separation between North and South continues to increase. All right, and then in 1859, a man that you see pictured here, John Brown, tries to start a slave revolution. He leads 18 men to a town called Harpers, Ferry, Virginia, His goal was to take control of the town and encourage the African Americans in that town to rise up against their owners. He was going to move throughout the South, leading a revolution of slaves. But it failed almost as quickly as it got started. He took some townspeople as hostages, and he barricaded himself in the engine house of the town. The United States Army was sent in to remove John Brown and arrest him. A man by the name of Robert E. Lee was sent to arrest John Brown. After a short fight between the soldiers and John Brown's men, John Brown was arrested. He was later put on trial and sentenced to death. And the morning of his hanging, the last words he spoke were, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Basically trying to, saying that slavery, the question of slavery, will not be answered until there's some more bloodshed, until there's a war. And this is in 1859. This is 2 years before the Civil War starts. That brings us to the final event here before the Civil War, and that is the election of 1860. These are all the candidates. You had Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, who's pictured here. You have Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. He supported slavery in the territories. Now, Stephen Douglas, he actually supported the people of those territories voting for whether they wanted slave states or free states. Then you had the Constitutional Union Party, which is John Bell of Tennessee. He was a slaveholder, so you can kind of guess what side he was on. And then a new party called the Republican Party, and their candidate was a man named Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, and he was against slavery spreading to the new states. During his campaign, he told the South that he had no intentions of ending slavery. He believed that eventually it would die out. He just did not want to see slavery spreading to new states and new territories. And so that is what he campaigned on. A lot of Southerners saw Abraham Lincoln as someone who was going to get rid of slavery. They saw him as someone who was going to take away their property. And so in a lot of states, he wasn't even on the ballot. Matter of fact, he wasn't on the ballot in any of the southern states. So he wasn't even a choice for people to vote for in the southern states. But even though that was the case, Lincoln wins the election. And many Southerners believed that this was a sign that their states were losing power in the government. And a lot of states, especially states like South Carolina, a lot of those states thought, hey, we don't have much power here. We don't like this, so we're going to get out. We don't want to be a part of the USA anymore. We want to start our own country. And that's where the idea of secession comes around. And so you have slavery, which is creating this separation between North and South and the attitudes between the people. You have the southern states that believe that it's their right to own these slaves, and that if the North is trying to get rid of slavery, they're trying to take away their property. And then you have the idea of secession, the idea that if we don't like what's going on in our country, we can just leave it and start our own. And that is what happens and where we're at the end of 1860, just as President Lincoln is about to take office. Here you can see the votes for President Lincoln. Lincoln are the blue states or purple states. You can see Stephen Douglas is the pink state, and then Breckinridge and Bell, the green and the yellow. Okay, so you can see how that broke down. Lincoln didn't win any of the states in the South, but because he had more popular, because the northern states had more population, he was able to win the election, even though he wasn't on the ballot in some of those states. Now, in Minnesota, we had a lot of the same mixed feelings as the rest of the country. Minnesotans had mixed feelings because in places like Minneapolis, there were a lot of supporters that said that slavery needed to be abolished. But in St. Paul, where a lot of the Southerners would come up in the summer to escape the heat of the South, in St. Paul, they allowed slavery to happen. And so St. Paul wanted to make sure that those people were happy, so they supported slavery. So in one particular instance, a slave by the name of Eliza Winston is brought to Minnesota with her family that she worked for from the South. And she gets in touch with somebody, an abolitionist in Minnesota, that says, hey, you know what, you can be free. You're on northern soil. You're no longer a slave. come stay with us and leave that family. Eventually it goes to court, and the judge in Minnesota makes Eliza free. But that night, a mob tries to return her to the family she came north with. But luckily, they weren't able to catch her. She wasn't where they thought she was going to be. Eventually, Eliza is sent to Canada, where she spends the rest of her time up north in Canada. Okay, I'm going to go back to our learning target just to make sure that you take a look at that, and hopefully you can understand how slavery, how states' rights, and secession were part of the causes of the Civil War. Okay? If you have any questions, please bring those to class with you, and we can talk more about them in class. Okay? Thank you very much.